Good evening. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Gadi Schwartz coming to you from Los Angeles. And here's some of the stories we're watching tonight. Donald Trump could be indicted by a grand jury any minute now, marking the first ever prosecution of a former U.S. president. Our New York authorities preparing for his possible arrest. Then the UN calls it a final warning when it comes to dealing with the causes of climate change, saying we need to act now before it's too late.
Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast.
A deadly and hard-to-treat fungal infection is spreading across the U.S. and has the CDC worried. We're going to tell you what to watch out for. Plus, there is still plenty of anxiety about whether the banking crisis can be contained, and a lot of that has to do with the chaos surrounding one of the world's biggest banks. Then, 20 years ago today, the U.S. forces invaded Iraq. A look back at what we've learned as a country.
To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you.
And all eyes are on New York City tonight, where for the first time in history, a former U.S. president might get indicted on criminal charges. Before we get the latest from our team on the ground, let's do a quick recap. At the center of this is former President Trump, who is facing possible criminal charges in New York relating to a $130,000 hush money payment made to adult film star Stormy Daniels. The payment was made by former Trump lawyer Michael Cohen back in 2016, just days before the presidential election. And Cohen says he made that payment at Trump's direction, all because Stormy Daniels was threatening to go public about an alleged affair she had with Trump back in 2006. Now, President Trump reimbursed Cohen while he was in the White House, all of which was documented in the books of the Trump organization, but in a phony and false manner. Now, the former president is maintaining that he committed no crime and that his attorneys argue that he was a victim of extortion. But he's saying that he expects to be indicted and arrested this Tuesday, as in tomorrow. And he also went on to ask his followers to protest and take the nation back, reminding some of January 6th. New York City has been preparing for the potential of these protests all day, putting up these steel barricades in and around the Manhattan DA's office. NBC News correspondent Garrett Haake joins me now from New York City. Garrett, this image of a former president getting booked, getting fingerprinted in handcuffs, taking a mugshot if indicted. If he does get arrested, what does that look like? If you and I got arrested, we get put in the back of a squad car. Maybe we turn ourselves in at a police station. But what happens if this is the former president?
Yeah, Gadi, it's extraordinary to even think about, and what the former president could potentially face would look very similar to what might happen to you or I, but with really one important distinction. He's going to go through all of it with a Secret Service detail at his side. That's according to a source familiar talking to our White House team up in Washington. But the former president would still have to come through either the DA's office or the courthouse behind us. I suppose he could also go to a precinct. He'll get booked, fingerprinted, have his DNA swabbed, and he'll have a court hearing, an arraignment. He probably won't appear in handcuffs, and he almost certainly won't appear in kind of public more broadly. The Secret Service is highly unlikely to agree to seeing him be perp walked. It's just not the kind of thing that they would allow for a protectee who's also an arrestee. A bizarre situation.
And Garrett, can you bring us up to speed here? The former president has told his followers that he thinks he'll be indicted tomorrow. What are the chances of that happening?
It's possible, but he's basically guessing at this point, Gadi. He's also admitted, or his campaign's admitted, that he has no inside knowledge on that. He's really looking at the same information that we all are, that this grand jury is close to done with their proceedings, included based on the fact that today they interviewed a witness put forward by the defense team, by Trump's legal team. That usually only happens towards the end of the process. And he knows, reporting by outlets, including NBC News, that here in New York, they're getting ready. They're trying to change the security posture to be ready for the possibility of protests or even just to move a former president through downtown. So Tuesday, yes, it's possible. It's as early as it could probably happen, but that's a guess. It could be later this week, or it could not happen at all, I suppose.
In the meantime, Trump has been posting a ton. He's put up what looks like attack ads specifically made to go after Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg. He's asking people to protest. Has kind of January 6th vibes. What's the reaction from the DA?
Well, the DA hasn't said anything publicly, although he did email his staff over the weekend telling them that security is their top priority and kind of trying to rally the troops, making this argument that they won't be intimidated. They'll do what's necessary to defend the rule of law in New York. And I have to say, if it's January 6 vibes, it's January 6 light. I mean, there's a protest going on just behind our camera right now that has only about 20 people attending it. And in fact, some of the same online message boards where in the lead up to January 6th, you saw that big call to action that ultimately led some of those militia groups and others to come out to the Capitol on that day. Those same message boards, people are talking about the idea that they worried that protests around this issue could be a false flag or a way for the federal authorities to arrest them. There just doesn't seem to be that same movement in Trump's direction like we saw in advance of that day.
Garrett, keeping a close eye on all this. Thanks so much. And former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade joins us now. Barbara, let's take a quick step back here. This is all happening over $130,000. This isn't new, right? We've known about this for some time now. The former Manhattan DA chose not to move forward with the prosecution in this case because they thought it was a gamble before. Do you see it as a gamble, or does the Manhattan DA have a strong case?
Well, I think that depends on what the evidence turns out to be. We know that, at least based on Mark Pomerantz's account, that Alvin Bragg was initially lukewarm on the charges. It doesn't necessarily mean because he thinks the charge is not significant. He might simply have thought that the evidence was not yet sufficient. But evidence can grow as you continue an investigation. So it may be that the prior attorneys, for example, thought that Michael Cohen was the linchpin of the case and was enough. And it may be that Alvin Bragg said, he's a convicted perjurer. I'm not sure I believe him, and I'm not sure a jury will believe him. So maybe we need to amass additional evidence. And if they've done that, if they've been able to find other witnesses who can tell the same story or documents that can support what Michael Cohen is saying, he may have been able to take what was at one time a weak case or a lukewarm case and turn it into a strong one. So I think we'll have to see not only what the charging document says, but the evidence ultimately shows.
If indicted, what could Trump's defense be in court, specifically talking about Michael Cohen here?
Well, I think there's a couple possibilities. One is in any kind of a case like this, you know, a white collar type of a case, you have to prove criminal intent, that what you were trying to do was to defraud somebody. And it could be that he says, I never had that intent. That's one possibility. I think the other is to attack the credibility of Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen, as we said, is a convicted perjurer. He could say that he has an axe to grind, that this is a vendetta, that he's fabricating a story. In fact, we know that this attorney, Robert Costello, went into the grand jury today and that Michael Cohen was on call as a rebuttal witness. It could be that that attorney is going to disparage the story that Michael Cohen is telling and provide a different narrative for the facts. So there are a couple different ways you could attack a case like this, and I think it remains to be seen which way. It may be that Donald Trump attacks it in every way possible, because that sort of is his typical MO.
A big question on a lot of people's mind, how does this play into a Trump 2024 run? Let's say he's indicted. Can he still run for president?
He can. There's nothing that would legally prevent him from running, and that's because the Constitution defines the qualifications for candidates for president. It simply says that the person must have attained the age of 35 years and be a natural-born citizen. And so efforts to add additional qualifications are deemed unconstitutional, and sometimes states attempt to do that, and they can't. It would require a constitutional amendment. So just being charged with a crime, even being convicted of a crime, is not enough to prevent someone from running for president. And so there may be some court dates here where Donald Trump has to appear in court for various things, but other than that, I don't think it will prevent him from running. And in fact, I suspect he will use this as a fundraising cause. I think he will use this to further claim that he is a victim and to play into grievance politics, for which he is so well known.
Former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade, we really appreciate your insight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So it might be the first day of spring, but it does not feel like it here in the West. A new atmospheric river is expected to come down hard tomorrow. It is the 12th one this season. Yeah, a dozen atmospheric rivers have hit in the last few months, and it has caused chaos for so many people who have seen their homes flooded. Some have even seen the land around their houses collapse. And if it's not homes, it's livelihoods. This video was taken from a farm in Hollister, California. And while that horse you see right there survived, the owner says it was one of the lucky ones. Meanwhile, up in the mountains, more snow is on the way where roofs have already collapsed from the weight of so much snowpack. But in the middle of all of this, there might be a silver lining. All this rain is helping alleviate California's historic drought. Check this out. On the left is Lake Oroville Reservoir in July 2021. On the right is what it looked like last month before a lot of these snowstorms and rainstorms that we just saw. Now, we're going to get into all of this and more with NBC News meteorologist Bill Cairns. But first, Bill, got to ask, how long does California have until we start to see this new storm percolate its way in?
Tomorrow morning, and this is different, Gadi, than the last. The last one was a ton of rain. You had 3 inches of rain, but it was all during the overnight hours, so the impacts really weren't there for people commuting and traveling. This is different. This is right during the heart of your Tuesday. So here's our next atmospheric river, and once again, it's coming from the tropics, from Hawaii, and this is going to be with us tomorrow morning, really through about midday Wednesday. So it's kind of like a 36-hour event, and then it will be exiting. So it won't be quite as long as some of the huge ones. That's why the impacts probably won't be extreme, but they'll be localized bad. And of course, we're worried about all the levees holding, too, because right now they're holding a lot of water. So here's 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. The yellow on the map is moderate to steady to almost heavy rain. The blue shows you where the snow is. So we're talking snow in the southern Sierra, San Bernardino Mountains, and Gabriel. And this rain tomorrow morning, San Francisco, Monterey, Santa Barbara to L.A., eventually into San Diego, probably about 8 a.m. So your morning commute, nightmare in Southern California tomorrow by your standards. Then by 6 p.m. Tuesday, the rain is more hit and miss, but we'll still have some downpours out there, possibly over right at downtown L.A. and also on the coastal areas. But the steady stuff will be earlier in the day. And then as far as flood alerts go, of course, we're worried about the mountainous areas with the heavy rain and the snow melt. Once again, this is like a rinse and repeat thing, right? And then also a few spots here in Arizona and also in Nevada. And as far as the rain totals, we're really targeting from San Francisco about an inch, down around Santa Barbara, possibly 2 to 3 inches. L.A., same for you in San Diego, that 1 to 3 inch range for the total for the rain. So that's why we're going to have some urban and street flooding to deal with, too. And on top of that, the high elevations, it's still pretty cold in many areas of the West. Snow levels will be down low enough that, all those areas we talked about, Lake Arrowhead and, Bear Mountain there, the Bear Lake area, those areas could get another 2 to 4 feet, especially above about 6,000 feet. That's the magic number in the southern Sierra, Gadi, too. And then the final portion of this will be a windy storm, too. Not enough for, like, widespread power outages, but we do have high wind warnings, especially in the mountains, and we will have some downed trees and power lines, but I don't think it's going to be widespread, Gadi, so that's the good news.
I know a lot of places have the snow days. I mean, I'm not joking about this. Like, yeah, I wish we had a rain day because some of these storms, you try to drive around and they've been hitting around 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, but like zero visibility. And you're talking maybe an inch, 2 inches on some of the highways and some of the roads. Bill, I did want to ask about the reservoirs. It's been comforting to see how much they've been refilling. But I've been reading there's a lot of cases where we're seeing the release of absolutely massive amounts of water before these reservoirs are completely filled. Can you tell us why?
Well, we have two fears of the reservoirs. One is that they get too low when we don't have water, and the other one is that they get too filled up because then they have no choice but to release it down the stream. So this was as of November 8th. All of these are the reservoir capacity, some of the big ones here. That picture we just showed you, like Oroville, was at 30%. Well, this is where we stand now. 82%, wow. 70%, 89%, 87%. They don't want it getting too high and risk having to dump a ton of water at one time and flooding downstream. So they try to get a good control level. So that's why, if you want to say anything, Gadi, the reservoir system isn't big enough. We need to capture more of the water so when we get in these mega droughts, and that's a different discussion for the future. But here's the other thing we're going to be watching. The snowpack in the southern Sierra is the highest that we've ever seen. And we're now going to get worried about the flooding in the weeks ahead. So, we're going to continue talking. They already issued for the entire spring a moderate flood likely for a lot of the southern Sierra and for the central portions of the valley.
So as fast as we're letting it out, even more is coming in. Bill,
That's right.
Thanks so much. Meanwhile, all this flooding and extreme weather comes as the UN released a new report on climate change. And I know what you're probably thinking, another climate change report. How is this one going to be any different? Well, this report is 6 years in the making with work from thousands of climate scientists all around the world. And it gives the most definitive answer on the state of the climate crisis, which is that time is running out.
It tells us, and we know that climate change is here now. It tells us that climate change is a real threat to human and planetary well-being. And it tells us that climate change is throwing its hardest punches at the most vulnerable communities who bear the least responsibility.
Right now, over 190 countries are working towards limiting global warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. But according to this report, that's probably not even going to happen. However, there is hope. The report says things could turn around if we make big changes right now. Joining us right now is Brahim Al-Husseini. He is the founder and managing partner of Full Cycle. Brahim, can you walk us through this report? What did it tell us?
So back in 2015, the United Nations put together this panel of scientists to monitor and amass all the latest data on climate change and keep us all abreast so all governments and corporations can adjust and do the right thing so we can try to keep this planet stable. Unfortunately, like you said, we are doing too little and we're very late to the game. So right now we're at a trajectory, unfortunately, to get to over 3 degrees of warming, which does not seem like a lot to most people. Now, remember, first, we're supposed to keep it under 1.5 degrees, but even 1.5 degrees is a planet that we don't recognize. It's a planet with 70% of the corals bleached, with 79 million climate refugees, with the hydro cycle moving around. So places that we're used to being able to grow food where we can't grow it anymore. And we're overshooting by double that the way we're headed. So we need to stop emissions immediately, which of course we're not going to do given the little efforts that are being put forth. One of the things that isn't spoken enough about is methane emissions, because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and it only makes up 1% of atmospheric greenhouse gases, but it's responsible for 36% of the warming in the first 20 years of its emissions. So if we focus more on that gas in the near term, we can slow down this warming cycle and buy ourselves time where we can do so much more. Technology will advance. We'll be able to plant more trees. Thankfully, nature gave us the most advanced technology through photosynthesis to be able to reforest the earth and draw down CO2, because CO2, even though it's the most potent greenhouse gas, it's the weakest, but it's also the longest lingering. So we need a long-term solution to how to draw it down from the atmosphere, and trees are the biggest, best technology we have to do that.
I know a lot of this change is dependent on people. It relies on people actually wanting to make a change. Is that proving to be a harder sell than it would seem?
So most people don't realize that the biggest levers we have are actually through governments. Just like we saw, our government did a fantastic job by the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, that became the law of the land, and that's the biggest climate legislation in history. So government is a huge key to this. So how we vote makes a big difference in leveraging our ability to fight climate change. You know, find candidates who understand the science, who care about the issues, and vote for them if you care about having a stable climate, which we all should care deeply about because it affects our health, it affects our pocketbook, it affects our fellow community. And that's, you know, our civilization is built on a stable climate. We do not want to disrupt that.
Brahim, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And still ahead, the CDC says there's a serious global health threat that we need to keep an eye on. This time it is fungus. But before you get freaked out, because it sounds very much like a certain apocalyptic show, we are going to separate fact from fiction. And later this hour, a state of emergency in Miami Beach. What started off as spring break partying quickly turned deadly.
We're just out here to have a good time, and it shouldn't be like this. Can't be dodging bullets. It's crazy.
Now, we should say this before we get into this next story. This is not the beginning of The Last of Us, but this is a story about a drug-resistant fungus that is spreading worldwide. It is called Candida auris, C. auris for short, and it is spreading in hospitals and nursing homes. Sometimes it causes yeast infections. Sometimes it gets more serious and into the bloodstream. And here's where the CDC gets worried. These fungi can be drug-resistant, which means that some cases can be deadly. Joining us now is NBC News medical fellow Dr. Akshay Syal. Dr. Syal, let's talk about this fungus. What do we know about it, and what happens when you get it?
Good evening, Gadi. Yeah, I think you did a really good job at hitting on the points of why the CDC is so worried. So Candida auris, it's a type of fungus, and for those of you who don't know, we worry about infections from things like viruses, like COVID or the flu, bacteria like staph infections, and then there's also fungi that can cause infections, although less common. And so why we're really worried about here is that this fungus that's infecting people seems to be really drug resistant, meaning that things that we would throw at fungal infections normally aren't really working. But Gadi, I really want to point out here that those with healthy immune systems aren't who we're worried about here. It's those who are elderly, those who are spending a lot of time in and out of hospitals, and those who have uncontrolled chronic health conditions like uncontrolled diabetes or heart failure. Those are really the patients that we're talking about here, and those are the ones that we're really worried about.
How widespread are we talking here? Should you be worried if you're spending a lot of time in a place like a hospital or a nursing home? I know we're talking about something that could be drug resistant. Nursing homes and hospitals are usually pretty sanitary, or at least people try to keep them that way. Is this resistant to the types of things that you use to sanitize hospitals and nursing homes, or is this just a case of somebody may not be doing a good enough job cleaning those places up?
No, it can be resistant to a lot of the things that we're cleaning, and that's what has a lot of people worried. Hospitals often have infection control protocols in place. If you've ever been in a hospital, you know that you'll see people going into rooms with gowns and gloves and masks. We saw a lot of this during the pandemic, and really the point here to stress for those who are going into these things, really make sure that those signs are there for a reason. Make sure that if you are somebody who is required to wear a gown and gloves and mask going into a room, you are following those protocols. Make sure your doctor is following those protocols. And always make sure you're washing your hands in and out every time you go inside a patient's room.
And Doctor, I know that there are 4 strains detected right now. They seem to be coming from South America, South Africa, Southern Asia, Eastern Asia. Are these strains all very different from each other in terms of how they act, or are they basically the same super strain?
Yeah, one thing we always talk about with COVID is the variants, right? We started with the original variant, then we had Omicron, we had Delta, then Omicron, now XBB.1.5. So there's a lot of concern here about different strains and how that could affect the treatments. But Gadi, unfortunately, the short answer is we don't know. What we do know is that these strains, we think, kind of popped up around the same time. But what we don't know is how are these different strains going to matter for patients? Is one strain going to cause a more severe illness? Is one strain more likely to spread? Those are things that we really don't know. But Gadi, one thing that is interesting is, one of the leading theories about why this infection, you're seeing the case numbers rise so much, is actually climate change. With global warming, we see that fungi outside of humans are getting adapted to live in warmer environments. Humans have a temperature of, average 98.6 degrees. By that global warming, they may become better adapted to survive in humans. So that's unfortunately one of the leading theories out there about why we're seeing those case numbers rising so much.
And yet another reason why we should be more aware. Dr. Akshay, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know about you, but when it comes to these massive banking problems, the thing that is hardest for me to shake is how suddenly everything seems to be happening. And before you really get your head around what's going on, there seems to be this miraculous solution, then another instant crisis, all while billions of dollars are in flux. Now, the latest bank to suffer is Credit Suisse, and this isn't some regional bank somewhere in the mountains of Europe. It helped build Switzerland's railroad back in the 1850s. It is a huge deal. And now Credit Suisse is under new management. UBS, another Swiss bank, officially bought it yesterday for $3.25 billion. And this handshake that you're looking at right here, that is basically a $5 trillion handshake, because the combination of the two banks creates that much in total invested assets. And in case you can't fathom a trillion, one way to visualize it, it's a million millions. Joining us now is NBC News business and data reporter Brian Chung. Brian, negotiations for this deal shifted into high gear this weekend. Then it was announced yesterday before markets opened after the week. Did this deal happen quickly, or was this a long time coming?
Yeah, Gadi, everything has been happening so quickly. I mean, when you just rewind to the middle of last week, it seemed like we weren't even talking about Credit Suisse. And then all of a sudden you recall that the Swiss National Bank, the equivalent of the Federal Reserve in Switzerland, essentially threw it a $54 billion lifeline. Apparently that wasn't enough, that liquidity that they offered them on a temporary basis, because then the Swiss government got involved and said, hey, you know what? We're going to make a pairing. We're going to have a shotgun marriage here between UBS, another Swiss bank, and Credit Suisse, the other big bank in Switzerland. Now, the reason why this is important, the reason why we're talking about this here in the United States, is because Credit Suisse is defined as one of the 30 banks as designated by international regulators as systemically important. Translation, they're so big that if they were to go under, it could potentially take down the entire global financial system. Now, that sounds a little bit dramatic, but it underscores the reason why in just a few days the Swiss government came in to make sure that they can make this deal happen, because the stakes were just too high for Credit Suisse to go under. And that's perhaps one reason why markets responded positively, even here in the United States. The Dow Jones adding quite a bit, over 1% in trading today, Gadi.
And Brent, how are people with money in smaller banks going to trust regional banks after all of this? Are they going to start running towards the too big to fail banks?
Yeah, well, certainly there's a lot of money moving around. And I think one reason is because a lot of people are learning about the $250,000 insurance cap as set by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And people are learning the hard way from what happened at Silicon Valley that there isn't necessarily a promise forever that you're going to have all that money in that bank if that bank were to, in the worst case scenario, go under. So people might be taking their deposits over that $250,000 cap, moving it elsewhere. And some people might say, well, I'll just keep it in these too big to fail banks, like, for example, Chase or Bank of America or what have you. So there's a lot of money moving around inside the U.S. financial system. And that's one reason why we've heard some lawmakers who were pressing Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen just last week about the potential for all of this to culminate in the big banks simply getting bigger. Now, again, it's a little bit too early to say whether or not that's actually happening, but certainly a concern, at least in Capitol Hill, Gadi.
Brian Chung, thanks so much. And after the break, a troubling Pentagon study. Some of the military pilots and ground crew who fuel the planes are being diagnosed with cancer at higher rates. But first, you got to see this. Tons of snow in the Utah mountains forced a herd of elk to head towards greener pastures for food. And oh, did they find it. This herd of elk settled on an exclusive golf course and its neatly manicured lawns. But now, with the snow disappearing, the club says these new guests have worn out their welcome. Check out this human chain trying to coax the herd off the course and back up the mountain. We'll be right back. And it's time now for some of the other headlines we're watching tonight. Amazon plans on laying off 9,000 employees in the next few weeks. This round of cuts is expected to hit their corporate and tech workers. And these add to the more than 18,000 employees let go by Amazon beginning in November of last year. An American hostage in West Africa who was held for over 6 years has been freed. Jeff Wood was a Christian aid worker before he was kidnapped by militants in 2016. U.S. officials say it was a years-long team effort, and they are thanking Niger for helping in the release. A jury has found 3 men guilty of murdering rapper XXXTentacion in a 2018 robbery. Prosecutors say 2 of the men were gunmen that day, while the third was the getaway driver. The men were also found guilty of armed robbery and will return to court in April for sentencing. A new Pentagon study has found that military pilots and ground crews experience higher rates of cancer. In fact, air crews had a 24% higher rate of all types of cancer. The study comes after retired military aviators raised alarms on the subject for years. Now the Pentagon has to go back and conduct another review to understand why the crews are getting sick. And it is like a scene right out of Ted Lasso. The soccer coach in a press room for a post-game debrief, but this time, let's make it the White House. The cast met with President Biden and spoke at a daily press briefing to talk about mental health, which is a recurring theme on the hit show.
We all know someone who has, or have been that someone ourselves actually, that's struggled, that's felt isolated, that's felt anxious, that has felt alone, right? And it's actually one of the many things that believe it or not, that we all have in common as human beings, right? And so that That means that it's something that we can all, and should talk about with one another.
And it's spring break now, and it's one of the most popular places to visit. That's Miami Beach, but the mayor wishes that wasn't the case.
We don't ask for spring break in our city. We don't want spring break in our city. The volume of people in our city, the unruly nature of too many, and the presence of guns has created a peril that cannot go unchecked.
And that is because this past weekend, 2 different shootings killed 2 people and hurt 2 others. And now the entire city is under a state of emergency and has already seen a mandatory curfew. Joining us now is NBC's Gadi Venegas. Gad, the curfew ended early this morning, and just a few moments ago, it seems like the city commission voted against extending it. With 2 people dead, why did they do that? And what does a spring break state of emergency look like?
Gadi, I spoke with a business owner right after they voted to not extend that state of emergency and curfew into next weekend, and he brought up some interesting details. So what he told me is that next weekend there's a big music festival in Miami, and what they've seen from the past years when this music festival, it's a festival that people call Ultra, when the crowd comes in for that festival, a lot of them will end up on Ocean Drive, and he tells me that that crowd is usually not as violent. That's what they've seen in the past years. So a lot of the business owners, he says, did not want to see that state of emergency and curfew next weekend. So, it's a difficult decision to make for city officials. They imposed this last night. So between midnight and 6 a.m. from Sunday to Monday, everything's shut down here in Ocean Drive. Gadi, this is an area where people come specifically to have a bar, to have a restaurant, to have an area where they can party late at night. But it's also where these deadly incidents happen. So it's difficult for the city to make a decision thinking of what's best for public safety, but also the economics and the businesses that have to remain open. So as I mentioned, what this state of emergency meant and the curfew is that they had to shut down between midnight and 6 a.m. Also, that a lot of the liquor stores or businesses that sell alcohol for people to take off premises had to stop selling alcohol at 6 p.m. before that curfew and that state of emergency began. And this is only the area of South Beach, not all of Miami Beach, but South Beach being where most of the spring breakers and tourists will come visit during this time of the year. So we're going to move forward at the moment with no state of emergency and no curfew next weekend, Gadi.
And Gad, this isn't something that's new, right? This has been happening for quite some time. I think this is the 3rd year that Miami Beach has issued a state of emergency. Is the city talking about doing anything to prevent this from happening in the future?
Gadi, they've done things to try and prevent that. They've increased police presence. In fact, the mayor said that in both of the deadly shootings, they had officers arrive at the scene within seconds. They were nearby, but with the large crowds, it's difficult. But really, the main issue they mentioned is the presence of guns. The mayor said that within the last 3 weeks, they've confiscated 70 firearms. So they want to find a way to keep the guns away from this public area, which is quite difficult. They have discussed the possibility of fencing this off in the future. And, there's a constitutional issue with having public detectors in public areas. So maybe it'll be a ticketed event that will be as cheap as $1, where people will pay and have to go through these metal detectors in order to enter the area. Those are just ideas that were discussed at this meeting. But for now, you have increased police presence and authorities hoping that next weekend will be different, Gadi.
Gadi Venegas, thanks so much. And now to some breaking news. 500,000 kids will not have school tomorrow in Los Angeles. That's because thousands of employees at LA Unified Schools will be on strike. Just moments ago, we heard from the district's superintendent who officially announced the closure, saying, quote, "We've run out of time." We're talking about the nation's 2nd largest school district, and it could be shut down for 3 days. NBC LA's Tracy Leong has more.
When we fight, we win. When we fight, we win.
Shouting messages of support for SEIU Local 99.
We're at a desperation level.
The union representing LAUSD teachers, UTLA, will also join SEIU in a solidarity strike. Together, the 2 unions represent more than 60,000 LAUSD workers.
We know that if we don't stand with SEIU, our communities will not get what they deserve.
SEIU is demanding better conditions for LAUSD cafeteria staff, bus drivers, custodians, teacher assistants, and other education workers, asking for a 30% wage increase, additional staffing, more hours for part-time workers, health benefits, and maintenance for campus cleanliness.
We recognize the harshness of the financial conditions in this community, considering inflation, unaffordability, cost of living. That is why, from the very beginning, we put on the table a historic compensation package that meets and beats inflation, then some.
The LAUSD superintendent hoping to reach an agreement to avoid a strike.
Up until now, we have not necessarily received in a formal or informal way a response that would bring the leadership of the union to the table to negotiate through this process.
Unable to reach a decision together, LAUSD is now preparing for a major disruption that will cut off learning for several days for 600,000 students.
We hope that the parents and the community understand how important and how just this fight is. We hope that they can be compassionate about the educators that work at schools without enough pay.
Reporting in Westlake, Tracy Leong, NBC4 News.
The Navajo Nation is the largest Native American reservation in the United States. It is split between Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, and by size, it's actually bigger than 10 U.S. states. Now, today, in 2023, according to the tribe, some 30% of the tribe does not have access to running water, and that very issue just landed at the Supreme Court. The reservation argued that the federal government has a duty to provide them with water, specifically from the Colorado River, which is currently experiencing a historic drought. But the federal government, as well as the states of Arizona and Nevada, say there isn't enough water to go around. Joining us now is NBC News Supreme Court reporter Lawrence Hurley. Lawrence, today's oral arguments have been 2 decades in the making and over a century if you go by the original treaty here. What's been going on for the past 20 years, and what's the Navajo Nation's argument based on?
Yeah, so this has been, as you mentioned, long in the running. The lawsuit was filed 20 years ago. And it was put on hold for a long time because they were trying to negotiate a settlement with the state of Arizona that would allow them to get some of this access to water on the Colorado River. And when that didn't happen, Navajo turned back to this lawsuit where they're saying that the U.S. government owes them a duty of trust to ensure that they have access to water, which may or may not come from the Colorado River. But probably would involve some of that. And that's what a lot of the thrust of the discussion at the oral argument today was about. And to what extent do they actually need water from the Colorado River? And to what extent they just need an assessment of their water needs?
I think we have some of a bit of an exchange between Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch and one of the lawyers from the Justice Department during today's oral arguments. And that lawyer was arguing that the Navajo Nation isn't entitled to the Colorado River water when Justice Gorsuch asked a question. Take a listen.
Could I bring a good breach of state contract claim for someone who promised me a permanent home, the right to conduct agriculture and raise animals, if it turns out it's the Sahara Desert?
I don't think you would be able to bring a breach of contract claim.
Really?
I think...
You don't think that's a breach of good faith and fair dealing? You don't think at least it would state a claim?
I don't think so.
So it seems like Gorsuch, at least, is skeptical over the DOJ's claims. Any sense of how the other justices might be leaning?
Yeah, so Justice Gorsuch, one of the 6 conservatives on the court, has always been quite friendly to Native Americans in other cases he's had. So that wasn't so surprising. Him and the 3 liberal justices kind of seem like they're sympathetic to the tribe's position. So that means for the tribe to win the case, they need to win over one of the other 5 conservatives. And based on the argument today, it seems like maybe that Justice Amy Coney Barrett might be the one who's kind of in the middle on this case. She asked questions that could indicate she's somewhat sympathetic to the tribe, but she also asked questions that went the other way. So she may end up being that decisive vote on this one.
And how much does the original treaty between the Navajo Nation and the United States play into this?
Yeah, it goes right back to that. It's 1868. The tribe was allowed to return to their ancestral lands, and the U.S. government said, well, we're going to promise you that you have the resources you need to farm on that land. And the tribe is saying, well, you can't do agriculture without water. That's the point that Justice Gorsuch was making. And so the government says, no, we have a general trust to tribes because that's established under US law. But that doesn't mean that we have to actually provide water.
Lawrence Hurley, something we'll be watching. Thanks so very much.
Thank you.
And 20 years ago this week, the United States carried out its first airstrikes and ground invasion of Iraq. Operation Iraqi Freedom would last almost a decade. Today, those who fought in Iraq are still dealing with the physical and emotional burdens of the war.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq.
Welcome back to this expanded edition of NBC Nightly News on the night that Operation Iraqi Freedom is unfolding fast in the air and on the ground.
But right now, we are literally at the front lines. There are no American units, at least not with the 3rd Infantry Division, that are ahead of us right here into Iraq.
We will use all of our skill and all of the tools of our trade to take the fight to the enemy.
Train to kill and to win, and that's all they do. I mean, there's no roundabout way of saying it.
20 years ago, a shock and awe campaign would mark the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom. The mission was clear: take out Saddam Hussein.
The gravity of this moment is matched by the gravity of the threat that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction pose to the world.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
The U.S. invasion was quick. Saddam Hussein would eventually be captured and killed, but the fighting in Iraq was just the beginning.
And there were a couple people that I remember who had some questions about, like, okay, well, why are we really here? Those feelings, being in combat, quickly go away when there's bullets flying at you.
The years after the invasion were a series of hard lessons: civil war, insurgencies, countless Iraqi and American casualties. By the time U.S. troops pulled out, an estimated 200,000 Iraqis died, many of them civilians, while more than 4,500 U.S. troops lost their lives. Many tens of thousands more suffered permanent scars.
And I remember my head was bowed in prayer like it was before every mission. And then I'm not even a kilometer down this road. Boom.
Dan Nevins didn't think he would survive that IED explosion.
I remember reaching up for my legs because as they were stuck in the vehicle and I'm laying in the dirt, and I felt the unmistakable arterial blood spurt with every beat of my heart. And I knew I was going to die. Making my peace with God. Saying goodbye to my wife, my daughter, and just sort of giving up.
He lost both his legs and endured years of painful recovery.
Early on when in the hospital, you're surrounded by so much pain and suffering, like this spark of humanity that just keeps you going. You're like, well, if that guy can smile, then I can smile.
As time went on, he learned to manage the physical wounds.
Started learning to walk again. You notice that then the invisible wounds, especially the emotional wounds, started to become more prominent.
Today, Sergeant Nevins has a new mission in life, teaching yoga and meditation, something he sees as a silver lining to the war.
I often say that I'm glad I had these experiences because it's made me the person today.
And after the break, schools across the country are worried about students using AI to cheat. But how hard is it for a teacher to actually tell if a student or a robot wrote an essay? We're going to put one educator to the test.
Relatively confident that I'll be able to pick the students out.
All right. If you had access to AI while you were in school, would you use it to help write your term paper? Do not worry. I'm not going to tell anybody. But that is a big concern for schools as AI becomes more accessible. So NBC News Digital reporter Andrew Stern called up his old high school teacher to see if he could spot that robot. And here's what he found.
This is something I know the students are talking about. It's something faculty are talking about. I think it's opening doors to dangerous terrain.
So I had an idea. What if we called up my favorite high school teacher and put him to the test? We designed an experiment to see whether or not he could spot an AI cheater. So here's what we came up with. Toppich would give 9 of his students a day to write a politics essay. I'd choose some of them to cheat, but Toppich wouldn't know how many. Without knowing who wrote what, Toppich would grade all the essays and guess which were by the AI cheaters.
Do you think that you're going to be able to spot which of your students I select to use ChatGPT?
I'm going in relatively confident that that I'll be able to pick the students out.
All right, let's meet our contestants on to spot a cheater. How many of you have heard of ChatGPT?
We've all heard of it, and probably all of us have used it at some point.
Do you think of ChatGPT as cheating?
I feel like it is cheating because it's defeating the purpose of the assignment, which is to strengthen you as a student, especially if it's your writing skill.
I think it's cheating. It's like using a calculator to create an English paper.
Are there those of you that want to be in the cheater subset? Oh wow, everybody wants to cheat on it. How confident are you that you've picked the cheaters out of the bunch?
On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm probably at about a 3. Front end, I would have probably said I would have had a confidence level of probably a 9. But yeah, I'm not feeling that great.
All right, let's get into it. How did Toppich do?
The grades on these essays were across the board higher than usual. Essay 1 was really well constructed. This was generated by a student, I believe.
So essay 1 was Lakes. That is a fully student written.
Essay 2 is probably the most uncertain of all 9. I tend to think it probably was student generated.
I got you.
Essay 3, I believe, was student generated. Essay 4, I believe this is student generated. Essay 5 is well written, and I believe this is student generated.
100% AI.
Essay 6 I also had is student generated. Essay 7, I had it down with a question mark, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say student generated. Essay 8 seemed to be a little bit different writing style and such, so we'll see whether I'm striking out again, but I think 8 with AI.
Swing and a miss. That is Anya's, and it was fully student generated.
I'm gonna be honest, I should have prepared for this a little more.
I'm going to end this this fiasco with essay 9. This is the one I feel most confident is AI generated.
Number 9 is not AI generated, it's a control.
Yikes. Final score, Toppich 3, ChatGPT 6.
I think it changed my mind because I low-key read Nico's and I was like, this is definitely gonna get caught.
Honestly, I wouldn't want this to be my life where I'm second guessing whether this is being used. I think I was definitely overthinking it. I would jokingly say that sometimes if the students spend as much time just writing the essay as opposed to trying to find ways to manipulate technology to get the assistance that they need, we would be in a much better place educationally.
Scary new world. Before we go, competing in stride, a group of skiers isn't letting their disabilities keep them from the slopes.
I've had a lot of challenges that prevented me or made it difficult for me to even imagine that something like this was possible.
And skiing should be for everyone who wants to give it a try, right? Well, one Massachusetts organization is proving that one run at a time. The Stride organization is bringing people with disabilities to the slopes for their own competition. And NBC News daily anchor Kate Snow spoke to a few of them about their experience.
In the mountains of Massachusetts, it's off to the races.
Go! Go, Andy! Go!
And for these competitors, this is a culmination of what they've been working on all season. The Great Race, taking place through Stride, an adaptive sports organization empowering people with disabilities.
It feels like freedom, really.
Heather, who's visually impaired, has been skiing with her guide Marcel for 10 years, communicating with him through helmet radios.
I can do things skiing that I can't do on dry land. It's been a struggle because she's so unpleasant. Can't you tell?
No, it's
we have a
amazing.
wonderful time.
The day holding special meaning for everyone on the mountain.
I've had a lot of challenges that prevented me or made it difficult for me to even imagine that something like this was possible. I have found a lot of strength in skiing and a lot of freedom in the mountain. If I can ski, I can probably walk and I could probably do anything. And it just gave me a lot of self-empowerment.
For 11-year-old Ben, the twin brother of competitor Marin, skiing is a way to connect.
Because she is disabled, we can't do a lot of things together. So being able to ski with her is a really nice opportunity.
A big moment for 5-year-old Oscar on race day, who started out the season tethered to his instructor, but then...
What did we do to the tether?
Kissed it goodbye.
We kissed it goodbye.
Building confidence on and off the course.
Yes!
For this adventurous bunch, at the end of the day, it's really just about the thrill that comes with hitting the slopes.
All right, Nikki!
Kate Snow, NBC News.
Look at that. That does it for us. And for those who are celebrating a new spring, happy Nowruz. I'm Gadi Schwartz. We'll see you tomorrow. But until then, stay tuned now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.